Okay, hello everyone. Lydia, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, good.
Good.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thanks for joining us. Welcome to the latest in our series of webinars to help researchers and practitioners share knowledge and experience in natural flood management. Today, we're very pleased we've got Lydia Burgess-Gamble from the Environment Agency, and she is going to present on working with natural processes, the evidence behind NFM. Just before I hand over to Lydia, a couple of quick housekeeping things. Your microphones have been muted on entry, so please keep those off. So they should have a red symbol on your microphone just to keep down background noise. However, please do ask questions. Please use the speech bubble option, the chat function, and yeah, ask questions, make comments. And if you see somebody else has made a comment that you think you can respond to, you'd like to respond to, please do. We've had some quite lively conversations going on in the background during previous webinars, so yeah, please do that. Yeah, Lydia will answer questions at the end. There'll be 10 to 15 minutes for that. Given the number of people on this webinar, I don't think we're going to be able to cover all the questions, but Lydia has said she'll answer the ones that we don't have time for, and we'll post a note of those responses on our website. And thanks to those also who submitted questions before. We'll try and cover a number of those as well at the end. The webinar is being recorded, and you can access that. That'll be on our website in the next couple of days. So the webinar is part of a program being run through the Natural Flood Management Research Programme. This is a 4-year, £4 million NERC-funded programme carrying out novel science to improve understanding of natural flood management. And where possible, including quantification. In fact, the next webinar, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later on, is on modelling and some of the work that we're doing on that. So we're looking at a range of NFM measures in different types of catchments, flooding scenarios, and at different scales. And the aim is to improve evidence and understanding for policymakers and practitioners. And there's 3 projects that form the programme. A really important part of the programme is working with partners, collaborative working, and today's an example of that. So what Lydia is going to talk about isn't actually part of the programme, but we're showcasing, providing a platform for a range of speakers, practitioners and researchers to present. So yeah, the Environment Agency is one of our most important partners. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Lydia.
Thank you. Thanks, Jared. I'll just load up my slides, so bear with me a second while we get those up. Can you see my slides, Jared, before I get started?
They're just coming up. Yeah,
okay.
Can now, yes.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you ever so much for inviting me to come and talk as part of this series. My name is Lydia Burgess-Gamble. I work at the Environment Agency in the head office flood risk management team. And I'm in the specific team that delivers research on flood risk management for all of the flood risk management authorities in England and Wales. So our research is undertaken for partners in local authorities, drainage boards, Welsh Government, Natural Resources Wales, as well as ourselves at the Environment Agency. And within our small team, we all lead on different topic areas. And I lead on natural flood management and the environmental side of flood risk management. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is a piece of work that we published back in 2017, which was a piece of work to develop the evidence behind natural flood management. And we did this in partnership with our contractors, who were JBA Consulting, who worked with a range of universities, the James Hutton Institute, Newcastle University, Forestry Commission, colleagues at Lancaster University, and a wide range of different partners to pull together the science in one place. But before I get started, what I'm just going to do is give a brief overview for those of you who are not familiar with the Environment Agency as to who we are and what we do. And after that, I'll go into discussing why we're so interested in natural flood management and what the evidence base shows us. As we get towards the end of the presentation, I'll then look forward to what we've got to do in the future to update our evidence base. So the Environment Agency, we're a non-departmental public body that was set up in 1995 following the Environment Act. And we are led by James Bevan, our Chief Executive, and Emma Howard-Boyd, our Chair. Our main role is to create better places for people and wildlife and to support sustainable development. And we have lots of different roles, one around regulating industry, treating contaminated land, improving water quality and resources, managing navigation, improving fisheries, conservation and ecology, and managing flood risk. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. So in the Environment Agency, we consider flood risk to come from a range of sources, from coastal flooding and coastal erosion, which has been really significant in recent years on the East Coast, river flooding, groundwater flooding, surface water and foul water flooding, and rapid response catchments. So flooding comes from a wide range of different sources, and the scale of flood risk in England is pretty large. It's one of our main natural hazards. Over 5 million properties at risk of flooding, and over 23 million properties that are not susceptible to flooding. 3.8 million of those properties are at risk of surface water flooding, and the remainder are at risk of river and coastal flooding. So the scale of flood risk is pretty large in England and appears to be ever growing in the face of climate change. As part of our role at the Environment Agency, we have the power, but not a legal obligation, to manage flood risks, main rivers and the sea, which is slightly different than other countries like the Netherlands, where acts of Parliament mean that they have a duty to protect their communities up to a certain standard of protection. Managing flood risk means lots of different things at the Environment Agency. It involves using a wide range of different tools. So the things we do include working with local authorities around flood risk assessments and ensuring that development is in areas at least risk of flooding or designed to be resilient to flooding. We do things that we're perhaps most known for, building traditional defences and operating flood risk assets to help protect people from flooding. We work on the coast to do beach recharge activities to help protect communities inland of the coast. We issue flood warnings and are involved in emergency response to severe flood events, as you would have seen in the news over recent weeks. We erect temporary defences, and we do lots of work to maintain watercourses and navigations throughout the country. So flood risk management in itself is really varied. It's a lot of different tools. What I'm going to focus on today is around the role of natural flood management. Somehow the slide doesn't seem to be clicking anymore. Bear with me a second. Okay. So today I'm going to talk to you about natural flood management. But before I go in to talk about the science behind natural flood management, I'm just going to give you a bit of a background as to why we see it being ever more prominent each time there's a flood. So things really changed after the 2007 floods. The 2007 floods were really significant. They had 3.9 billion worth of economic damages, affecting communities, affecting businesses, affecting critical infrastructure like sewage treatment work. And as a result of those floods, an independent review was commissioned by Sir Michael Pitt to look at what could have been done differently, what lessons could be learned, and what needed to change to ensure that we could better manage flood risk in the future. And Sir Michael Pitt's report came up with many different recommendations that have since changed the way in which flood risk is managed across the country. But perhaps one of the significant ones for this webinar is around the fact that he identified that we couldn't carry on building ever larger, higher concrete walls, that we need to look at a range of responses, a portfolio of responses to flooding. And within that, he talked about the role of natural flood management and softer approaches. So Sir Michael Pitt coined the term working with natural processes to reduce flood risk. And he talked about the need to protect, to restore, to emulate the natural functions of our rivers, our estuaries, and our coasts. And it was really after the Pitt report that we started to see an upsurge in the uptake of natural flood management, because as a result of the Pitt review, DEFRA funded 3 projects called the Making Space for Water pilots. That was Pickering Natural Flood Management Project, Honeycott Project in Somerset, and Work of Moors for the Future in the Uplands Peak District. And those case studies started to put together evidence over the years to help us understand the potential impact and benefits of delivering natural flood management schemes. Since 2007, we've seen a succession of floods that have really affected our country. Summer 2012 floods, which really affected Somerset. The 2013-14 floods had really significant impacts, especially on the coast, where we've had tidal surges affecting many of those communities. And then in 15 and 16, Storm Desmond, which had a significant effect up in Cumbria, where it overwhelmed defences, which were built to a really high standard of protection, around 1.6 billion worth of economic damages. The flooding has not abated, as we've seen over this winter. There's been really significant impacts in Yorkshire and in Wales and across the country. And the calls for more natural flood management still continue. I think every time we have a flood, the press seem to think it's the magic solution to everything, but we also get a lot of demand from communities who perhaps don't have other options available to them to help reduce their flood risk. Since 2007 in the Pitt review, we've seen a really massive increase in uptake of natural flood management. After those 3 Making Space for Water pilots went underway, there have been many, many more projects. And across the country, my colleagues who are working in all of these 14 different Environment Agency area offices that you see on this map, are all working with partners on DEFRA-funded projects or on other natural flood management projects. So there's been a massive upsurge in the uptake of natural flood management. We've also seen changes in the sort of leadership around natural flood management. When I joined the Environment Agency back in 2003, we very much talked about flood defence and stopping water and with solid defences. But now we see a move towards consideration of a wider portfolio of approaches. And that's supported through the 25-year Environment Plan, which talks about natural flood management solutions and how they should be used alongside traditional forms of engineering. And then at the Environment Agency, we've got great leadership from Emma Howard-Boyd and John Curtin, who's our Director of Flood Risk Management, who both talk about the importance of natural flood management as a means of making our catchments more resilient and helping people and their properties become more resilient to flooding. So there's been some great changes sort of in the policy and practice over the recent years. What I'm going to go through now is our evidence behind natural flood management. But before I get started, I wanted to talk to you briefly about my evidence base that I worked on and which measures we focused on when we talked about natural flood management. So in the evidence direction I'll come to in a minute, focused on 40 types of natural flood management. We looked at headwater drainage management, measures you might put in place up on moorlands or steep catchments. We looked at leaky barriers, putting barriers across rivers to hold back flood water to try and reconnect rivers and floodplains. We looked at runoff pathway management, measures that you might work with landowners to capture water on fields to slow its progress to rivers. And we looked at cross-slope woodlands, which can intercept flow off a hill slope and encourage infiltration within the ground. So those are the sort of measures in the upland part of the catchment that we focused on. And and catchment scale woodlands. And then moving down this fictitious catchment, we looked at the restoration of floodplains and river restoration. So about making rivers more sinuous, reconnecting rivers to their floodplains, storing water and slowing its progress towards towns and cities. We looked at riparian woodlands and floodplain woodlands with the idea of making our floodplains rougher, holding back floodwater, slowing its progress. We considered offline storage areas, which can be quite natural, or in this case, in this picture, is in central London on the Woodland, which is a big storage area that protects people from flooding, but also provides recreational benefits. And we also considered soil and land management techniques, techniques that could be implemented by farmers and land managers to encourage infiltration within the soil. And then finally, we looked at the coast and estuaries, and we considered measures like salt marsh, mudflats, and managed realignment. We looked at sand dune management and restoration, and we looked at beach management, looking at beach recharge and mega beach nourishment, which is a league particularly applied in the Netherlands. Beach recharge is all about keeping a system crest level on a beach to protect communities behind them. So we looked in detail at all of these 14 measures as part of our evidence-based to consider what we know and what we don't know about their effectiveness at reducing flood risk. And the reason we selected these measures is because we felt that they were very effective at slowing, storing and filtering water. And then what's come along more recently is a sudden interest in the capture of carbon to help us work towards net zero carbon in line with government recommendations. So many of these measures not only have flood risk benefits, but they can help us to capture and to store carbon. So what is the evidence directory? Well, the evidence directory is made up of 3 different components. There's the evidence directory itself, which is an online PDF document which sets out the science behind these different natural flood management measures. We've got a suite of natural flood management maps. And then we did a piece of work to identify what further research is needed to enhance our understanding of natural flood management. And I'm now going to go through each of those in 3 stages separately. So the evidence directory. For each of my slides, I've put a link to where you can find these documents, so that after this call today, if you feel like looking in more detail, you can access these easily. And I'm happy to make my slides available to anyone who wants to use them. So our evidence directory looks like this. It's a PDF online document on gov.uk. It's made up of this main report, and then it's got a supplementary literature review, which was independently peer reviewed by a range of academics to make sure that the science that our evidence base is based on is robust. So the evidence directory tells us what we know and what we don't know about the effectiveness of all of those measures that I showed you earlier, reducing flood risk. It pulls together science from academia, from grey literature and from case studies, and sets this out in an easy to use format, which looks like so. So we have 4 chapters, 1 on rivers and floodplains, 1 on woodlands, 1 on runoff management and land management, and then a final chapter on the coast and estuaries. We go through each of the different measures and set out the science behind them. Within our evidence directory, we use short little case studies to bring the science to life and to hopefully inspire you to look in more detail at the 65 case studies that are standalone documents that sit alongside the evidence base. So this slide here is showing you an example of some of these case studies. These are generally between 4 to 10 pages long, and they can give you some really good detailed information about how different people develop their natural flood management projects and what they found so far. In our evidence directory, we give you an indication of our confidence in the science based on how well academic studies agree with each other, how much research has been done to date in a particular topic area. And because the evidence directory is a really big document, and we acknowledge that not many people have much time in their day to read such long documents in detail, we've produced these one-page summaries, each of the different measure types, which tell you at a snapshot what we found. They set out the science from a flood risk perspective, but they also talk about the wider benefits, the ecosystem service benefits that could be achieved through implementing these different types of measures. So this is a really good entry level to the evidence base if you don't have much time available and you want to get an understanding of what the science is showing, or you want a pointer for the best case studies to look at. Within our evidence directory, we didn't just focus on flooding. My colleague Kate, who's pictured here, developed for each of the different measures a summary of what the science is showing around the wider benefits, those ecosystem service benefits that could be delivered through these natural flood management measures. This extract here is an example of floodplain woodlands. So Kate pulled together the science behind floodplain woodlands and looked at the range of different benefits that could be achieved, and we created these benefit wheels, or benefit pizzas, as some people have taken to calling them, which, depending upon the size of that slice within that pizza, gives you an indication of the likely benefit that you could achieve. So floodplain woodlands have a really high ability to deliver habitat benefit and climate regulation. So those slices are a lot bigger in the pizza than, say, health access. So this gives you a really good visual representation of the other benefits you could achieve through a measure. So importantly, what did we find? It's really hard to summarise what we found across those 14 different measure types, because each of them had varying levels of science. So what I'm going to tell you now is quite a sort of general overview. So we know natural flood management is not a new concept. We knew it had been going on for a long time. We knew that river restoration and floodplain restoration been going on since the late 80s, early 90s. But we really did not expect people to provide us with 65 case studies. So the fact that there were 65 ready to go case studies shows us that it's not a new concept. As an overview, we would say that natural flood management measures work. All of the measures we looked at were found to have a flood risk benefit, but we would say it's not a silver bullet. It's not. Natural flood management alone is not going to resolve all of our flooding problems. It's just one of our many tools within our flood risk management toolbox. In general, for river systems, for fluvial systems, we found that typically natural flood management measures reduce flood risk for smaller floods and smaller to medium-sized catchments. And this is based on case studies where we could find observed monitored data. So when we're talking about small catchments, we're thinking from 10 kilometres up to 70 kilometres square. And when we're thinking of smaller floods, we're thinking of those more nuisance type floods from 1 in 5 up to, say, a 1 in 30. So far, our observed data was showing, when we developed the evidence base, that it's most effective for those smaller catchments and smaller floods. However, what we weren't finding was that flood models were showing us a potential for natural flood management to reduce flood risk in larger catchments of medium to large floods. But what we really needed was more monitoring help validate the findings of these flood models. So whilst we're quite cautious about the benefits of natural flood management, we're hoping that further monitoring of projects will be able to enhance our confidence and that we might be able to see a potential to upscale to different scale catchments and different scale floods. It's not really surprising, but we found that at present, we think natural flood management should complement traditional forms of engineering or other measures like property level resilience. It shouldn't be seen as a one-stop shop solution or fix everything. Natural flood management also can have unintended negative consequences. For example, if you are reconnecting a floodplain, it could have a backwater effect in that way, storing water on the floodplain, and it could affect infrastructure or communities upstream. But we really need to think about that when you're designing your measures, putting the right measures in the right location, and thinking about around your natural flood management scheme. Is it infrastructure? Are there properties that we need to consider? Another potential impact of natural flood management is the potential to synchronise flooding. So by storing water on one subcatchment, it might synchronise the peak into the main river downstream. But on many occasions, these sorts of unintended consequences can be mitigated through proper planning, design, doing some assessment of the flood risk impact of the project. You can usually mitigate any potential negative consequences. Our assessment of the wider benefits of natural flood management shows that for most of the measures, perhaps with the exception of beach recharge, the literature was showing us that natural flood management has the potential to deliver multiple benefits to people and wildlife. So even if you might design a natural flood management scheme which has a small flood risk benefit, you can usually design it to achieve other benefits for people and for wildlife. That was the evidence directory. We're just going to briefly touch on the maps. As part of our project, JBA helped us develop some open source opportunity maps, which you can access for free. You can download the data yourselves, use it and adapt it, because we made sure one of the key principles of this part of the project is we wanted to create data that anyone could use, that you didn't have to pay for it and that you didn't need a license. So our opportunity mapping looked at 4 different measures types. It looked at runoff attenuation and gully blocking. It looked at riparian, floodplain and catchment scale woodlands, and it looked at floodplain reconnection. And this is an indication on the right-hand side of what the maps look like. They're very indicative. The idea is that they are a start of 10 if you're going out in a catchment for the first time, or you're meeting a landowner or a community group. These might give you some idea of what might be possible within your catchment. They're a starting point. And you can access those maps in 2 different ways. If you're like me and you're not very good with technology, then I would go to the JBA webpage on the left-hand side here. The link is at the bottom of this slide. It's almost like a Google style map where you can zoom in on the location that you're interested in, and then you can pick on and off the different types of natural flood management measures that you're interested in. That's quite a nice, easy way to access the data. If you're more tech savvy and you want to do some GIS work of your own, you can go on to our DEFRA metadata catalogue on the right-hand side, and you can access all of that data, take it off, and do clever GIS things with it. You can build on what we've done already and improve it. So there's 2 different ways to access those maps. Alongside the maps, we provided some guidance on how to use our evidence base. So one thing that we found through the development of our evidence directory is that often the measures themselves don't cost that much to construct, but sometimes the modelling to justify doing natural flood management can cost more than the actual construction work. And this seems disproportionate. So we've developed this diagram on the right-hand side to get people to think about proportionality when you're developing natural flood management schemes, and to think for how much money you've got or many interventions you want to put in, how much effort you need to put into an assessment of the flood risk impact of your measures. So at a really low level, using local knowledge can be really invaluable. What we've found in the past is that sometimes you could develop a really detailed model, sat in a dark room by yourself, not talking to anyone. But actually, when you get out on the ground, the landowners and farmers who you need to work with will say, well, that doesn't work like that. I can show you, do a walkover with you and show you which area of the pond where flood risk might occur, or places where I'm not prepared for there to be natural flood management because it's a really valuable piece of land to me. So I think when you're thinking about whether you need a model, you need to think about the extent and scale of your scheme and what existing evidence is already out there from local knowledge, desk-based studies using existing models and data, through to simple analysis of flood risk. Or if you're doing a massive catchment-wide scheme, then there might be a need to consider something more extensive. So hopefully this slide gives you a pointer as to where to start. We also developed this document some years ago with JBA. It's called Catchment Process Modelling Report, and it looks in more details at potential models that you could use. So one of the things with natural flood management is that there is no one or singing or dancing model that is the best to use. That's just been recommended. There are lots of different models all over the country, and they all have pros and cons. Natural flood management is really hard to model because it's considering overland flow, you're considering infiltration into the soil, water storage. So often models are built for one thing. So our flood risk models that we've got at the Environment Agency are really good at representing rivers and a floodplain, but they might not necessarily be considering infiltration and other factors that you might need to consider in your catchment. But this modelling report will give you an idea of what's out there already. The final part of our evidence base was around, we'd set out what we know already, what the science is showing us, but we knew that there were still science gaps that needed to be filled further in the future. So we set out for each of those measures what those science gaps were. And during the course of developing our evidence directory, we approached the Natural Environment Research Council and talked through what we were doing, and the fact that there was this issue around upscaling to large catchments. And this was, I think, around a time when there was fairly significant flooding happening around the country, and NERC was very keen to set up some natural management projects to help expand that science base. And this is how come we find ourselves with these three great projects being led by Joe, Martin and Nick, which are all very different and all helping to enhance that evidence base. Joe particularly focused on the lowlands and looking at the soils, Martin more focused on the headwater catchments, working with our colleagues to look at the impact on downstream communities, and Nick working in Cumbria, working closely with our colleagues through our Penrith office on a range of different sites. So what we're hoping is that in my next version of the evidence directory that we'll be able to take on board the findings from great projects and see how it updates our evidence behind natural flood management. As well as the NERC funded projects, my colleagues Ben, John and Chris are administering DEFRA funded NFM programme. So after Storm Desmond, the Minister at the time, Therese Coffey, set up a £15 million fund to implement natural flood management across the country. There's over 60 projects on this programme. There are either catchment scale projects being led by or slightly smaller projects being led by NGOs or community groups. The purpose of these projects is to reduce flood risk, but also to look at improving habitats, biodiversity, promote partnership working, and to contribute to research and development. So we're hoping when these projects come to an end in March 2021 that we can extract learning from these projects and use these to update our evidence base. In addition to the work of the NERC projects and my colleagues in the DEFRA programme, you might be aware of the Oxford St Martin Natural Flood Management Restatement, which is a really excellent source explaining where the science is at behind natural flood management. This has been in the process of being updated by Simon Dadson and his team, and we're hoping that that coincides with the end of the NERC funded projects and the end of the DEFRA funded projects, so that we have a really detailed summary of the science behind natural flood management. So what existing resources are out there, as well as the evidence base that I've been talking about, there's a lot of guidance out there that you might want to look at in more detail. So I've mentioned the Oxford St Martin Natural Flood Management Restatement. Over the border in Scotland, SEPA have their Natural Flood Management Handbook, which has got some really exciting case studies from Scotland. I've also been working with partners internationally with the US Army Corps of Engineers, who are responsible for flooding in America, and with our Dutch counterparts like Waterstart, who are responsible for the environment and flooding in the Netherlands. And they produced the Engineering of Nature Atlas, which is a glossy case study atlas, which is worth a look at. That's being revised and updated with new case studies. There's also been work by the World Bank on implementing nature-based flood protection. And in the autumn 2020, we're hoping to publish natural and nature-based features guidelines, which is a international document led by the US Army Corps of Engineers, which will set out some guidelines around using more nature-based solutions. So watch this space for those international documents. I've put the links down the side for you to access. There's some current R&D, which is ongoing at the moment, and I've just mentioned some of these already. So the US Army documents which are being updated at the moment, but very relevant in the UK is the Syria guidance on natural flood management. The Syria, the Construction Industry Research Institute, are leading a piece of work to develop some guidance around several different natural flood management interventions. Colleagues from the Environment Agency involved in that, as are a range of risk management authorities and other youth groups. And the idea behind that is to help provide a range of different guidelines and principles for designing things like leaky dams, runoff attenuation features, and floodplain restoration measures. Currently, we're just focusing in on a small number of measures, but the idea is Syria want to create a document in a format that can be updated and expanded in the future. So what's coming soon? Well, it seems like yesterday that we published the Natural Flood Management Evidence Directory, but the plan is to update it following completion of the NERC funded projects and following the completion of the DEFRA funded NFM programme. So after March 2021, I've got to update the evidence directory that will pull in the work of Joe, Martin and Nick. We'll pull in the findings from the DEFRA funded NFM projects. In particular, we want to add in more case studies to our evidence directory. It will pull in the latest science from the update to the Oxford St Martin Restatement. We will go back to anyone who provided a case study and ask them whether they want to update it or include anything new. And we will go out to the natural flood management community and see if there are new case studies that people want to put forward. So it's probably going to turn into a beast of a document, given that we already have 65 case studies. But we really want to see how the science has changed between 2017 and 2021, so that we can really understand where we are at with natural flood management and set out the latest case studies and their findings. So I'm just going to come to an end there, but if you're interested in the work of our flood risk management research team, we've got a Twitter account. If you want to contact me about the evidence directory, this is my email address, and if you feel like you might want to contribute case studies in 2021, then I'm going to be starting to create a list, so please feel free to drop me a line and just link to our evidence base. We also, in our team, produce a research newsletter once a year, which is on the right-hand side here. We've got one that's due for publication soon. Normally, I would say access it through our research webpage, but we're having some problems with that. If you are interested in joining getting the newsletter, please just drop me an email and I'll get one of my colleagues to add you to the list of people to send it to. So that's all I was going to say today. Probably back to Jared to see whether there are any questions that people want to ask.
Hi, Lydia. Thanks very much. Very interesting, very clear presentation. Yeah, there's a few questions coming in now.
You can see them all popping up.
A video printer and the scores coming in. There's one about evidence of costs and benefits. Are they available in pounds and pence, I suppose?
That's a good question.
In any of the case studies?
Yeah, so in the evidence directory, there's the multiple benefits section, and where we could get quantified evidence, we put it in there. But what we're doing in the case studies that I'm collecting, we're revamping the case study template. And one thing we specifically put in there is around quantified evidence for wider benefits. So we're hoping to collect more of that in the next round of the evidence directory.
Okay. Another question was, are you starting to see evidence for catchment scale soil carbon increase for flood risk reduction?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm about to start a piece of work on carbon offsetting and looking at the different types of interventions that we might employ at the Environment Agency to reduce our carbon. And one element of that project will look at land use change and habitat creation as a way of storing and sequestering carbon. So probably not through the evidence directory, but we might do through this piece of work that I'm about to start imminently.
Okay. And there's a question about, I suppose, about baseline information. Did you put in place any monitoring before putting the measures in place?
So that across our DEFRA funded projects, the projects really, really vary in scale. Some of them are really, really small, and some of them are much larger. Where possible, my colleagues tried to put baseline data in, but actually there were a lot of pressure to start construction of these measures. The minister wanted to see spades in the ground pretty quickly. So where we could, we did, but often I think people are relying on a paired catchment approach where they've got a similar catchment that they can compare against their NFM catchments. There are cases where we've already got pretty good Environment Agency monitoring infrastructure in place. So it's varied, I would say, from at the very minimum fixed point photography through to really much more detailed monitoring, and in some cases where we're really fortunate to be working with Nick, Joe and Martin, then we would have much better monitoring. So yeah, it's a perennial challenge of trying to meet the needs of getting things started and doing decent monitoring as well. So it's varied.
Okay, thank you. There's a question about the Environment Agency's influence on ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Schemes. I think that's the right acronym. And is there, and it's about a specification for landowners and performance-based example, for example, leaky woody debris dams.
So
Well, more generally, how's the Environment Agency interacting with DEFRA on the developing ELMS, environmental land management schemes?
So my colleague Chris Utley, who I think might be doing a talk here in the future, has been our flood risk lead inputting to the ELMS scheme. I haven't been that involved in it, so if there's really detailed questions about ELMS, what I'll do is I'll go back and I'll ask Chris, and I'll answer all the questions that you haven't been able to answer. So Chris has been inputting to ELMS. In terms of designing different measure types, we're hoping that the Syria guide will come up with a range of different design options for different measures. So we think of woody dams, then we'd hope to come up with a range of different ways that you can design a dam. So that could be a useful tool in ELMS for people to think about how they might want to go about that when farmers are designing potential measures.
Thank you. One of the questions submitted beforehand was about, do we have the evidence that natural flood management makes a real difference in a high rainfall event?
I think what my presentation is showing is that the science at the time when we published the evidence directory was showing we know that natural flood management works for those smaller, more nuisance events. What we need is the evidence for those higher rainfall events, and we're hoping, because we've got monitoring equipment in for a range of projects across the country, and we've unfortunately had a lot of bad weather over the last few years, that we might have collected some decent data to help us understand how effective natural flood management is for those higher rainfall events. So as well as the DEFRA funded schemes and the NERC funded projects, we've also got some really big projects happening. We've got colleagues working on the lead flood alleviation scheme, where they're working with partners on implementing a really significant amount of natural flood management at a really large scale. And it's those sorts of projects that are really going to help us figure out whether we can upscale to such large catchments. So I think I'm hoping we have in the next round of the evidence directory, but we don't currently.
Okay, thank you. Got a career advice question. Is there an NFM qualification? I guess probably not yet, but perhaps that's something that's coming. But
yeah.
Have you got any advice for anyone who's interested in working in NFM?
Wow, it's been a long time since I left university and got a job, so I'm perhaps not the best person to ask. I think the problem with NFM is it crosses so many disciplines, but I don't think there's any one institute that is giving you a qualification in NFM. So I know that the Institute of Civil Engineers, SciWEM, IEMA, they're all interested in NFM, and I think they'll probably we'll talk about it quite a bit, but I don't know of any qualifications in NFM, but maybe there are academics on this call who can correct me afterwards, and I can point you to some useful resources.
Thank you. You might get a flood of calls. A question is, are the Environment Agency case studies being shared with the Natural Capital Committee?
I did share it all with the Natural Capital Committee, actually, because there has been a sudden upsurge in interest from a range of different organisations on what they're calling nature-based solutions, and lots of people interested in creating case studies and evidence bases. So where I'm aware of people doing stuff on nature-based solutions, I've been pointing them to this evidence-based so that they don't reinvent the wheel. And the Natural Capital Committee is one group who I've shared what we've done already with, so that they're aware of it.
Thank you. There's a question about longer term impacts, positive and negative, and around the maintenance and liability issues with NFM. Can you offer any thoughts on that? Did the research cover that at all?
Well, that maintenance and liability is an ongoing problem as to who maintains these features. in a long term, because ideally, if they're designed really well, they sort of blend into the environment, and you don't almost know that they're a flood scheme. So it's how we ensure their longevity and their maintenance is a big issue that I don't think has been addressed yet. But my colleague Chris, who I talked about earlier, Chris Utley, he's starting a piece of work to look at how we could potentially create an asset register for natural flood management, so that we can keep track of what's been installed where within the natural environment, who owns it, and how much maintenance it might need. I mean, in an ideal world, we want to create natural flood management measures that are restoring a natural process and don't need much intervention in terms of maintenance. But I know things like leaky dams, that's not always the case. You need to be making sure that they're not collapsing. So it's an ongoing issue that needs to be addressed. I'm hoping that Chris's work might help us get us a bit closer to that.
Thanks. There's a question about, well, I'll read it actually. It's since modelling can be very expensive and NFM measures are often used or more effective on small scale, is modelling often used, or is it not cost effective? Are alternative, cheaper methods to assess flood risk and quantify potential NFM measures ever used? If so, what? And just before you answer, I'll mention it again just before we finish, but the next webinar is about modelling, so please do book into that one.
I think,
thoughts, Lydia?
Yeah, the supplementary guides that I talked about earlier might help you with this question of proportionality. People don't always do modelling. It really depends. Sometimes I think it depends on how you're going about funding your natural flood management measures, as to how much evidence your funding body wants around effectiveness. So the way we're set up at the Environment Agency is that we follow the Treasury Green Books rules around looking at the cost and benefits of different schemes, and we're quite evidence-based and quite focused on modelling. But natural flood management can be often funded from other means, from local levies, from other sources of funding, and it really depends what your fund is after. But you can do simple things. I think like site walkovers with someone who knows the catchment and knows the land that you want to work on. It's got to be invaluable, because no matter how much you spend on modelling, if people aren't willing to have the measures on the land in the first place, then it becomes a bit pointless. So I think my tendency would be to start simple, start with people's knowledge and experience, start with existing data, and then if you need to do modelling, or if you want to do it over such a large area that you think it's going to really significantly impact flood risk, then that might be when you want to do something more detailed. But there is a lot of evidence already out there. We own a lot of models at the Environment Agency. Local academics have often got models that they've used for research. I think the key thing is to create good partnerships and to use as much existing data as possible to start with.
Thank you. There's a question. Is it not dangerous to implement, or I guess might it be dangerous to implement localized NFM interventions in opportunistic locations, i.e. landowner permission, without knowing its larger scale catchment impact, which can only be assessed through hydrological modelling? Surely we need coordination and planning at catchment scale.
Yeah, I think coordination and planning at catchment scale is to be recommended. We've got colleagues at the Environment Agency who work on the Environment Programme with catchment coordinators, and they often getting to know your local catchment coordinator can be really good, because they're often linked up with a wide range of partners across the catchment and have a good idea of what's going on in that area. I think there's always a risk of putting something in opportunistically and it being constructed in a way that it fails and blocks a culvert or increases flood risk elsewhere. So I don't think we should be not advocating the willy-nilly implementation of natural flood management, I think we need to be proportionate in our level of assessment of flood risk impact, and just draw on existing knowledge and expertise from your communities, from your NGOs, from your flood risk management authorities.
Thank you. Another question is, where the implementation of an NFM project causes a land value loss or fall in productivity, how is this equitably dealt with? I'm aware that the Natural Trust are attempting to force their farming tenants to adopt measures like these, but are not expecting any reduction in rents paid. Could I just say as well that Stuart Clark from the National Trust will be speaking in one of our future webinars, so I think that would be an issue he will cover. But have you any thoughts, Lydia?
I don't know that I have any decent answers to that question. I might take away some of the more farming, land management questions and try and get Chris to help me answer those. A little bit out. I would just be guessing, if I'm honest with you. Chris is more in touch with the land management side of things.
Yeah, there's a question here. Is it evidence over time and the future? For example, efficacy of NFM measures as silt builds up behind intervention. I guess that's around long-term monitoring.
Yes, I guess there's some measure types that will become less effective over time as the natural processes restore themselves. And I think one of our challenges as a community is that it can be really hard to fund long-term monitoring schemes. So capturing that sort of information is really invaluable, but I don't necessarily have an answer as to how we make sure that the monitoring we set up is for the long term. Good work going on at Liverpool University. A chap called Charlie, I can't remember his surname, who works in Janet Hook's department at Liverpool University. He's working with like Norbury and Mersey Forest, and what they're interested in is looking at the natural flood management, potential to manage sediment. So hopefully some of Charlie's research might help us to answer some of those questions. Not only will it help us learn about how natural flood management measures last and long term, but it will also help us understand whether it reduces the need to do things like dredging or desilting. So it might have other benefits that we are only just learning about.
Okay, well, Lydia, I think we've only got a couple of minutes left, so thanks for answering so many questions. And yeah, thanks again for your presentation.
I'll try and if there's a list of the questions, I'll go through them over the next week and try and pull together some answers.
Great, and yeah, we can post them on our website. Thanks very much. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining and for the lively question session. Thanks for those. So just to tie up then, if you have any feedback, including on how it ran for you, do email either the NFM email address or as Lydia's contact details as well there. As I've said, there will be a recording available on the website in the next couple of days. The next webinar on the 21st of May is Dr. Barry Hankin, who's working on the QNFM project. So that's one of the 3 projects in the NFM research program, and he's talking about lessons on modelling NFM at micro and macro scales. If you're interested in finding out more about what we're doing, please do sign up to the newsletter. You can do that on the website, and you can also access previous issues. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks particularly to Lydia, and enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully you'll join us again for the next one. Okay, bye everyone.
Thanks, Jared.